Yas Marina, December 12, 2021. Lewis Hamilton is 11 seconds clear. 58 laps on the board, 1 to go. He is about to become the first driver in the history of the sport to win an 8th world championship. And then he doesn't. 5 years later, in the summer of 2026, Hamilton sits second in the drivers' standings for the first time since that night, wearing red instead of silver, with a different team principal on his pit wall. That team principal, Fred Vasseur, was not in Abu Dhabi that year as a rival, or a judge, or a conspirator. He was 700 kilometers away in spirit, running a midfield team called Alfa Romeo. But the race he had nothing to do with has followed both men into the present. Because in Formula One, some races never actually end. They just wait for someone to bring them up again. This is the story of what happened on that final lap, what the FIA admitted afterward, and why, half a decade later, people are still arguing about it in the same terms they used the night it happened. Lap 53 of 58. Nicholas Latifi's Williams meets the wall at turn 14. Safety car deployed. Under normal circumstances, that safety car stays out until the checkered flag, and Hamilton wins the championship on strategy alone, gapped out front on tires that had been on the car since lap 14. Red Bull knows this, so while the field bunches up behind the safety car, they pit Max Verstappen for a fresh set of softs. It is a gamble that only pays off if race control does something it has never done before. And here is where the timeline gets specific. Lap 57 of 58. Race director Michael Masi orders the 5-lapped cars, sitting between Hamilton and Verstappen, to unlap themselves. Not the entire field of lapped cars behind them, just those 5. Article 48.12 of the FIA's own sporting regulations, at the time, required all lapped cars to pass the safety car before it could come in. Masi did not follow that. Almost in the same breath, the lights on the safety car went dark, signaling it would pit at the end of that lap. 1 lap of racing. Green flag. Verstappen on tires 20 laps fresher than Hamilton's. Over the radio, Mercedes principal Toto Wolff told Masi directly that the call wasn't right. Masi's reply became one of the most replayed lines in the sport's history. Toto, it's called motor racing. We went car racing. Verstappen passed Hamilton before the lap was out. He was crowned champion by 0.5 points, the smallest margin in the sport since the current system began. That's the incident. Individually, it's a 9-second procedural call made under enormous pressure with millions watching live. But it didn't stay there. It became something the sport spent the next 4 years trying to metabolize, and it still hasn't fully managed it. To understand why 9 seconds carried that much weight, you have to understand what came before them. The 2021 season wasn't a runaway. It was the closest title fight in over a decade, and it had already turned physical twice. At Silverstone in July, Verstappen and Hamilton collided at Copse Corner at over 200 miles an hour, sending Verstappen into the barriers at 51 and out of the race. Hamilton was handed a 10-second penalty, then won anyway. At Monza in September, the two collided again, Verstappen's car landing on top of Hamilton's, the halo device, credited afterward, with protecting Hamilton from a wheel to the head. By the time both cars lined up in Abu Dhabi, they were tied on points, 369.5 apiece. The first time in the sport's history, 2 drivers had gone into a season finale dead level. Whoever finished ahead, with no other tiebreaker needed, would be champion. That's the pressure Masi was operating under when Latifi's Williams hit the wall with 5 laps left. There was no safe call available to him. There was only a call that would be scrutinized forever, whichever way he made it. Mercedes protested twice that night. Both were rejected. The team filed an intention to appeal, then withdrew it under pressure to preserve the sport's image heading into a new season. But the FIA couldn't just move on. 3 months later, in March 2022, they published a formal report. And here's where the story stops being about one bad radio call and starts being about an institution admitting fault to itself. The FIA's own report stated plainly that the sporting regulations had not been applied correctly that night. Not disputed, not contested by outside experts. Confirmed, on paper, by the governing body itself. And yet, in the same document, the FIA ruled that the race results stood. Masi, they said, had acted in good faith, a procedural failure with no procedural consequence for the outcome it produced. Verstappen kept the trophy. Hamilton kept nothing but the 11 seconds he no longer had. Masi was gone within weeks, removed as race director in what the FIA called a broader restructuring. He received death threats in the aftermath, and never returned to a Formula One paddock in that capacity. He did resurface within the federation, eventually taking on an independent advisory role with supercars, a touring car series in Australia and New Zealand he'd worked with years earlier. A quiet exit from the sport that had made him one of its most recognizable names for all the wrong reasons. Race control itself was rebuilt from the ground up. A rotating two-race director system replaced the single point of failure Masi had represented. A new senior advisor role was created specifically to sit above race control during high-pressure moments. A remote operations room, staffed independently and watching in real time, was added as a check that hadn't existed before. And the safety car regulations themselves were rewritten line by line to close the exact gap Masi had driven through. No more discretion over which lapped cars get to unlap. No more informal judgment calls about how a restart should look for television. The FIA didn't just discipline a man. They rebuilt the machine so that what happened in Abu Dhabi couldn't happen again in the same shape, even if they never took the trophy back from the man who benefited from it. Which raises the obvious question, and it's one that F1 still hasn't agreed on an answer to. If the call was wrong enough to end someone's career and rewrite the rulebook, why wasn't it wrong enough to change who lifted the trophy? That question has split into two camps that haven't moved much in 5 years, and both of them have real people standing behind them, not just internet noise. One camp is built around Niels Wittich, the man who eventually took over as race director after Masi. In April of 2026, Wittich publicly defended his predecessor, calling him a scapegoat. His argument wasn't that Masi did nothing wrong. He conceded Masi changed procedure without waiting the extra lap regulations implied. Wittich's point was structural. Any decision that night disadvantages somebody. A red flag wasn't legally available because there was no danger to personnel or a blocked track. Leave the safety car out, and the title is decided by a mechanical failure of another car, not a wheel-to-wheel finish. Wittich's sharpest criticism wasn't aimed at Masi's call at all. It was aimed at the FIA leadership that let a single official absorb 5 years of consequence alone, with what he described as none of the institutional backing race directors had received under the previous FIA president. The other camp doesn't dispute any of Wittich's facts. They just weigh them differently. Mercedes' position, never formally withdrawn, was that the rules exist precisely so a governing body isn't making judgment calls about what makes a better finish, live, on air, under pressure from a team radio. If Article 48.12 says all lapped cars unlap, and only 5 of them did, that isn't an interpretation. It's a specific, documented deviation, on the record, in the FIA's own report. To this camp, we went car racing, wasn't neutral officiating. It was a decision to manufacture a spectacle the rulebook didn't authorize, in the final laps of a season that had been level on points for months. Both of those positions can be true at the same time, which is exactly why the debate never resolved. A single official can be failed by his own federation and still have made the wrong call. The FIA's report, holding both of those facts without picking a side, is, in its own way, the most honest and least satisfying document the sport has ever produced about itself. There's a wider version of this same disagreement running underneath F1 as an industry, not just as a fandom. Every governing body that officiates live sport in real time faces the identical structural bind. Rules written for clarity, in a rulebook meeting reality, at 200 miles an hour. decided by one person with seconds to choose, replayed for years afterward, in slow motion, by people who had all the time in the world to get it right. Football has VAR reviews that still end in shouting matches. Cricket has third umpire calls that split entire nations. What makes Abu Dhabi different is scale. It didn't just cost a point or a wicket, it decided a world championship on the final lap of the final race of a tied season, in front of the largest television audience the sport had ever drawn. That's why it became the reference case. Every governing body since has had to reckon with the idea that transparency after the fact, a published report, an admission of error, isn't the same thing as correcting the outcome the error produced. What's changed since then isn't the facts. It's who's carrying them. In January of 2025, Hamilton left Mercedes after 12 years and joined Ferrari, a seat he had never driven a competitive lap in before turning 40. His first season there was, in his own word, a nightmare. No podiums across a full campaign, for the first time in 19 years in the sport. Outqualified by teammate Charles Leclerc 19 times to 5. Fred Vasseur, the man who signed him, said afterward that he had personally underestimated just how much 20 years inside one team's systems, one team's people, one team's way of doing things, had shaped Hamilton, and how hard it would be to rebuild that from zero in red. 2026 brought the biggest regulation overhaul in the sport's history. New chassis, new power units, new sporting rules, and with it, something Hamilton hadn't had in a while, a car that gave him room to drive the way he used to. By June, at the Barcelona Grand Prix, he took his 106th career win, snapping a drought that had stretched back through the end of his Mercedes years. Reporters covering that weekend noted Hamilton had taken to describing his own mission at Ferrari in a specific phrase. He was there, he said, to remember who I am. The implication commentators drew wasn't just about form, it was about identity, about a version of himself that some believed had never fully returned since Yas Marina. Vasseur, for his part, has spent his tenure since Abu Dhabi 2021 dealing with entirely different fires: team performance, regulation uncertainty, the FIA's own late clarity on the 2026 power unit rules, which he pushed back on publicly ahead of the season. He is not a figure from the 2021 controversy. He is a man now responsible for the driver it happened to. 5 years and one championship-defining night later, trying to build something that outlasts it. He's also a team principal who has lived the other side of officiating pressure himself, pushing the FIA for clearer regulations in Bahrain testing this year, arguing that gray areas in a rulebook cost teams races long before any driver reaches the grid. It's a smaller stakes version of the same complaint Mercedes made in 2021. That ambiguity, wherever it sits in the rulebook, eventually gets resolved by someone's judgment call, live, under pressure, with a result nobody can walk back afterward. So where does that leave the sport in 2026? The rulebook was rewritten. The race director was replaced, twice over. The report was published, in full, admitting error. And still, the trophy from that night sits exactly where it landed. Every time race control makes a marginal call in a title fight now, and there have been several since, commentators reach for the same reference point, the same 9 seconds on lap 57, because the sport never actually settled what it thinks those 9 seconds were worth. Broadcasters still cut back to that lap whenever a late safety car threatens a points lead. Stewards still get asked, in press conferences, whether they've learned anything from Yas Marina. 5 years on, it isn't history yet, it's precedent, and precedent gets tested every season a title race goes down to the final laps. Hamilton is racing again, like a man with something to finish. Vasseur is building a team around him that has nothing to do with what happened before either of them worked together. And the FIA, 5 years on, still hasn't answered the one question its own report left open. What does it mean to admit, on paper, that the rules were broken, and let the results stand anyway? That's a question the sport keeps almost asking every time it comes back around to Abu Dhabi. Whether it ever actually answers it is still open. If you want to be here when, or if, it finally does, subscribe, because this isn't a closed case. It's a story the sport keeps reopening on its own.